Nhớ trong số linh sự tử đã na của nhà hóa nhẹ cò, trong xe trả tàu tôn chi là sở hóa sở cho nó. Nếu na của nhà là nhận tôn chi cho nó ra đến hưng hoại thì cho lưu chúa. Tôn ý tập lâu nhớ đầu của nhà video hóa cá. Cụ và thế cái xe thì nên sẽ đào vô là công chế là rèn được của tiếp lea. The wind was brutal as Gongchi and Jialia rode toward the east where King Kietu's kingdom was. The weather had been against them, raining one day and windy the next. Today it was cloudy and dark, no sun in sight, and it was also very cold. She felt her fingers were going to fall off, and Gongchi must have noticed because he decided to take a break and make camp for the night. He ordered a few men at arms to hunt for food, and a few to get wood for fire. He began setting up tent, and she got off her horse to find a place to sit. Her arms and legs felt as if they were ready to be torn off. She took one look at her wind-kissed hands and felt pain enter her heart. When she looked up and watched Gongchi continue sitting up, she wanted to hurt him. The truth would be known soon, her husband had warned her. Be patient. It was only his patience that had kept her hanging on. She had barely slept, afraid for her life, but she knew that somewhere out there Shuokeng was watching them, and that kept her pushing forward. The men at arms returned with some kill and wood, and she took that moment to find water to bathe. It had been a long ride, and she was beginning to smell. Gongchi looked up as she stood and asked, "Kayamurachi?" She replied, "Kuyamuntiadeda, kumalitakalo." "Tacha, kiekuwakalua. Kachisamu, nuchirongo." Without waiting for him to approve, she began walking down the hill. The distance between where they had made camp and the river was farther than she assumed, but once she got there and her hand felt the water, she let out a breath of relief. She dipped her hand in, cupped a handful of water, and brought it to her face. The wind blew, and she felt a chill against her skin. "Nolly na, yukadadeka yomomo," Shuoking's voice said beside her. She jumped, and he caught her before she fell into the water. Before she could speak, he lowered his lips and kissed her. When he pulled away, she saw the hunger in his eyes as he removed a small white rag from the side of his pocket. He dipped it into the water and brought it to wash her neck. He gently began to clean her, and she closed her eyes, feeling loved as he pulled her into his arms. "Otenya, kamutsa katema, kutumitasha, kupakalina ora ku uchitao. Teshi vilunto telute, yochunda paute pahatia, kuchimushia, katili yomatakinda ku. Tatu kalushia kandeminji, to kulumbe ronda kalushwa hailu." Jialia shut her eyes, and tears began falling down as she wrapped her arms around him. "Kumali oli kahaima, thasa chakuche. Chỉ cho ý rau lì, tại kia thế tôi là, cú yếu ô lúc có mua sáng giống cả chỉ son trai." He finished washing her and then kissed her once more before he said, "Mu, sao nhân tình để trả lời được cả? Mà nó bự cái chỉ son trai, cú nhân được cái isha." When Jialia came back up the hill, she noticed that the latest kill was roasting on a stick over the fire. She saw that Gongchi had finished setting up tent and was sharpening a dagger. She pushed all her emotions underneath her feet and tread on to find a place to sit. Through the flames, she saw him watching her, but she endured his stare and focused on the towel that Shokeng had used to wash her body just moments ago. From the hidden bushes, Shokeng watched as Gongchi watched his wife with a glare that held too much desire. His heart broke at the thought of how he had been betrayed so violently and how he had missed seeing the signs. He had fought battles with Gongchi, made him the general he was today, and the man had no second thoughts to push him off the mountains to die. His hands clenched into a fist, and he let out a heavy breath. It hurt to watch her, to be this close to her, and pretend to be dead. But he knew that in order to figure out the truth, he had to lay low, to carry on the absence so his wife could be protected. He saw Gongchi rip up a rabbit leg and handed it to her. She took it, and when the other man disappeared down the hill to gather water, she turned toward the forest where she thought he was laying low. Just seeing her deeply filled eyes with love made his heart ache. He never thought he could love as deeply as this, and he never knew how powerful love could be. His mother had been right. The woman who could steal his heart was worth fighting for, and worth pushing to live and survive. She finished her meal and walked inside her tent as Gongchi came back up the hill. He went into his own tent, and Shoking said a silent prayer as he continued watching over. Jialia felt a hand on her face, and she woke, sitting up to find a woman dressed in white sitting beside her. She was a beautiful woman with long black hair and a pearl necklace around her neck. She was smiling, her gentle eyes peering into hers. Jialia felt fear into her heart, and she pushed back from where the woman sat. Chisonchai kuma, minya, she whispered. Jialia's heart sank. Go, goya, goya shugnya. La, gusaga kapoya karachi, dokumu. Jialia followed the woman out of her tent, where she led them both into the forest and into a clearing with two bamboo leaves as a roofing, and there lay Shokeng deep in a sleep holding a dagger. Jialia's heart broke, and tears filled her eyes as his mother smiled and took her hand. Ocho kalaluku tumitu, kuhe kahaitia, kuluneng kehlu kincheng, giờ kia thế tua, cụ cho tan trò cho Shokeng. Giờ nữ trong này cha là lần nhà lý cụ thế là do lúc tàu nữ xứ. Có tới nó nữ ra đánh nữ hai tia, thầu do nữ chỉ muốn nữ chỉ bỏ lấy cha. Cô lưu xin tia, chẳng kỳ kia tàu, nữ chán chán cho, thầu nữ chẳng mê mê. Anh nữ lúc mi xưa qua tới dự đó cô hai tia, cô nia. Mama, ai thọ có lúc cụ. Jialia began sobbing. His mother continued. Cô khai có. Nữ lúc xưa qua chỉ bỏ ý rong đã cô ra kê xa. Thầu cô cho nữ chê, cô trai chấp lỡ kê hình trai hai tia. Cha chỉ bỏ lưng tư yo là lúc nữ. Vì tên nữ luôn chê mua chỉ rong sự tế sự chờ. Mình nhá. Cô khai có lý nó nè. Cô giờ lúc tấn kỳ rồi sợ kinh lần tại hàng lợ. Để sự xin hôm nào một lúc tấn kỳ chỉ là cô là mò. Nữ giờ có, sao kể nấy cho sự phai nụ nó, giờ luôn đâu là ôi khó kể cỡ đồ này xưa nó mò. Có yếu trừ dài này kia có sao chờ. Có dân nhỏ bỏ cả trắng. Chỉ sống rừng lần tư. Rừng có tù khen tí lần cầu xưa nó mò. Ô lúc xưa cả tù, ô lúc xưa cả tờ. Sống trai lợ. Xin hôm nào một, có do tù giờ trú số cân sợ từ lúc khó tù lọ. Chẳng pha, thế sẽ sai lù hại. Thế là yon chia tao cho nâng pay, or mo lu xuyên nhộng với tay chi rong ni nó. Jialia turned to her sleeping husband on the ground, and then looked up at his mother. Nia, cô mà oli có hay. Rong, rong cơ. Sơ là, sơ kia. Jialia jerked awake in her tent and sat up. The morning light was around her, and she pushed open the flap and found Gongchi preparing to leave. She got out of her tent as he smiled up at her. Come ba tao lo? He asked. Giờ come ba chi lo nó? Giờ tao sơ kế cho cháu bên đâu. Trình chuan đại với mà lên một sao. Oli, come ba chi lo. King Kiatu's kingdom was vast and rich with color as Jialia and Gongchi made their way into the entrance. The men at arms were red and blue and carried golden swords as they paced the entryway. As soon as they showed up over the hill, the men at arms blew two large horns alerting of their arrival, and King Kiatu appeared at the balcony of his mansion. This was the first time Jialia saw the man up close, and he held a deep resemblance to his mother. She felt her heart sink with pain as a smile graced his face and he came down to meet them. Gongchi helped her off the horse, and the two made their way to meet the king halfway. As soon as she saw him, she burst into tears and fell to her knees. He immediately reached up and held her to stand. "Chị hóa đại kia tu, cũng mất kiện chị share của thế tốt sao có va cái chế. Thọ có chị tê là bá trú của mò," she cried. "Mình nhá, rồi share tại tàu có mò, của chế là những nhà có chế thia. Mò lù đã chỉ ở thả là chế cho. Lo, công chị, lo." The men at arms were brought to a different building to rest, and she took the arm that the king offered her, and they both walked into the mansion. It was designed with a beautiful rich red, and blue stars filled all the walls. A table of warm ale and food was waiting as if he knew they would be arriving soon. He patted her hand and looked at her with a smile. Mu, mu ra đây cho, mu ra đây lòng có gì con giờ, cho lọ bên nói bơ màu kế ta, mua lù ra chỉ bên mà lý thả. She walked up with the servants, and they led her into a room where a bath was waiting for her. She undressed, and had never been happier to see a bar of soap. She washed herself as best she could, and finally smelled and looked more like herself. She dressed in the clothes provided and came back downstairs. Dinner was the most grand she'd had in a long time as she finished her plate, and the servants began removing the servings in front of her. She wiped her mouth and watched as Gongchi smiled and offered his appreciation to the king. The warm fire was burning before them, and it caused her to become exhausted. Chỉ hơi tại cái điều cũng chừng tao tia cái như nó sao lúc mong sang được số kinh sa cái tôi là sao có chế là Jalia said. Cú chỉ bảo cái một chỗ lần tư, cú thấy đi tôi sao có. Cú hay có bảo hay tia cú như chuyện chân hay tia số kinh tôi. Thằng con đó cũng muốn thiệt cái tao nữa lúc kể. The king smiled and leaned back in his chair. Số kinh nhớ ý tôi nâng shit tao hành. Sao xin nữa tôi mà luôn tôi yếu chủ lo năng trả sơ. Chỉ tao lo năng trả lên nào mà nín chuyện kia xia. Công chỉ sat up. Cái bảo đã chỉ tia. He turned his attention to the man. Có khai cú, có nè, có hợp bảo đã chỉ. Chỉ hóa tại, cú yêu tu bỏ số cưng bả tê bóng đồ cá hà. Cú vô chỉ tao nữa. Ý tôi nâng bóng này nữa bóng nó kể, nhưng kia chỉ tao xia lợ. Giờ nữa chẳng kia tao thấy kể ní hơn tu yêu sơ. The king laughed and took a drink from his ale. Số cưng nữa mua nữa ít xăm bóng bế chỉ mua. Cũng chẳng tao tía giờ nữa tua tía lợ. Luôn tu yêu chủ sở, nữa yên chữ ca lên nó. And then he turned to Jialia. That's she. Cú nhẹ có ua cú tu nhá. Cú hai li nào. Cú mỗi tu tu ua cú san thiệt nhá trò. Giờ có xã có cú bá có tê tía này kể. Lần nhớ cú tu tu vấn đề trò. Cú mà li bá có. Jalia's face paled. Cú yêu số kinh tu ta ra. Cú lần chỉ tao đã chỉ. Ta chỉ nói số kinh chỉ nhớ nó là nà. Cú chẳng hai tía giờ nữ lúc có tê tía. Giờ cú yêu mua có bố cho lỡ tu. Nữ yếu chủ sở trao lọ sơ. Ô li nào. Trên tay hành lợ. Cú chỉ tao ôi lúc cộng trong đa chu. Cú yêu thó có tàn ra cái tú lùa chơ chu. Tổ xin đa chu. Có dân có sát tệ. Lần thứ dân cú tu tu. Kể cú chia nữa. Yếu con ta. Jalia's face broke into horror. Có ôi chỉ tao li có. Có mua cú chỉ tao rồi lỡ tu nâng nà. The king smiled. Ôi dạ thế li chỉ tao. Có tổ cho cú chế lợ. Cú cho lù dân tu lù. Công chỉ interrupted. Lầnตื่นđa chu nói như tao thằng đó lắm. King Kietu's eyebrows raised at his question. Tao cơ. Ôi dạ. Có xã cùng thế lắm. Nodding, he replied. Yeah, cô xã cùng tệ. Vì cũng trơn trái lìa là ô của bọc của sẽ. Công chỉ. Cứ chuyện nhớ cùng tệ đó hối tại Kietu của tôi đã chỉ. Có tí ở số kinh tôi thơ tu gì. Nâng ship hệ. Her mind ran to where Shokin was and why he wasn't making himself present. But her thoughts were interrupted when a guard came to pull her up from her chair where the king demanded she be locked up. Was she wrong to come here? Was the king going to betray them all? What if he had already killed Shoking? She screamed his name as the guard simply picked her up and threw her over his shoulder, carrying her up to the tower to be locked up. Gongchi laughed and replied, "Chỉ hóa tại kia tu, cú yêu thọ đâu có tu đa chu có tông trả lời sát tệ. Giờ cú yên có yêu chủ ôi lu chống lo chấp lời đó cú." The king nodded and replied, "Oli." The tower where Jialia was kept was quiet, and she could hear rats making their way across the floor. She heard the door opened, and she saw Gongchi walk in with a tray of food. He set it down before her, and she gave him a dirty glare. "Có là order chi?" she asked. "Thọ có ki. Oli chỉ hóa tại ôn nói nhớ lợ. Có bảo nà, số cái như tôi là tiền à. Chỉ muốn nu nữa cho cá lọ lợ. Khỏi rong kề kia của mà lúc có một thấy xí nâng." She laughed. "Cái sai để cũng chơi con nó lọ. Cái ấy tôi nâng sỉnh sẵn à. Cái như bí chỉ tao số cái như khó tử. Ý lọ ó lọ lọ số cái lúc bây ngừng cầu sư." She stood up. "Yeah. Giờ cái chân tao cú mù lọ. Ta tiền nâng cái như trường họ của hai số cái lúc bây ít xí nâng một sư. Chỉ mỗi ít nụ tử của hai cái lúc bây đó kể lúc. Thảo cú xá cho coi để ni nhân đó kiến chú để cái kỹ. Chỉ mỗi ít cho của lúc có mà. Có yêu chỉ nhau của lúc." Laughing, he replied, "Cái bảo trợ giờ cái sai tiệt cú bí chỉ tao số cái. Cú luôn chơi mua nè, rong đầu cha nè lúc cổng bao nè. Chơi mua đã, chơi mua lư." She cried as she tossed the tray at him. "Rong, cú vả thế cái xí hai tiệt lử mò xí cái cú lúc mình chơi mua lư nào giờ có tụt gì một tay xí nè. Có như kia chỉ đi." Jialia forgot what day it was and what hour it was. She had been fed food that was stale and 2 cups of water a day. She relieved herself in a corner, and her hands were still wearing iron cuffs. The only sign of life was a small window where she saw a bird fly every once in a while. She had stopped crying, for her throat had gone dry. No one had come to see her, and she had no idea what was going on in the outside world. She was afraid, deeply afraid that this time Shokeng wasn't coming back for sure. The last time she had seen him was in the forest before they arrived in the king's palace. She began sobbing and heard footsteps as a few servants came to her. The guard on watch opened the door, and the servant smiled at her. "Siwa tai ka kulam ba ka? Nuna la yan datsu." This caused her to begin shaking, and she fought her heart to stay calm. In her heart, she said a silent prayer. "Shokeng, karutila, kapanakua." A stage was set up with two large drums on the side where the villagers had gathered for the fight. The king sat at the very top with the view that allowed him the best. Several young suitors dressed in black and white were waiting, and among them was Gongchi. The king looked up as the freshly washed and beautifully dressed Jialia was brought in to sit beside him. She had been crying because her eyes were red and she was shaking. Once she was seated, he stood up and raised his arms for silence. "Rong xian hu nao ne shara de gong gen ta su? Bei tu min sai gong du zha le na. Yo ya leng tu ta zha lang yi chi bao le na. Tie shi, ya ne da zu yen gu tu. Ma ne te le dao nun bao ne she o." Jialia let out a soft cry as a man wearing all black with a mask that covered his entire face entered the ring. He was tall, with long black hair. She felt her heart skip beats as she realized this was a king's son. "Dao ko ying, dao ko to la tao, dao ko tao kian Jialia shao te," the king shouted as he sat back down. He smiled at her as tears fell down her cheeks. "Bi dao." The man in the black mask entered the ring, and one of the men wearing white came in. He let out a blood-curdling scream, and the man in black threw a left hook, sending the other man down with a thud. Jialia covered her face and let out a cry. "Si ho tai, thọ có chỉ uli no thọ có tia," she cried. "Có tia có của ba con nè, chẳng nó có chuyện có li có tia. Sai mà, cú tu nó kinh kinh cậu li hả, kia sẽ lưng tiêu gì nè." Another man entered, and the man in black won again. This led the other men to become fearful, and they began backing away. Gongji laughed and pushed his way through. "Có hình cơ ya, Jai lệ chủ của tôi sư ta," he shouted as he ran toward the man in the black mask. The two men became engaged in a fight, a battle that held fists and feet that probed and attacked, leaving blood and spit on the stage. For the first time, the man in the black mask had a chance to lose. Jialia held her hands together. She was afraid because she didn't want either man. "Chỉ hoa tai của thọ có rau cơ, giờ có lũ sa số cần ý rau hở có lũ nên kê thọ có cho của mù," she whispered. He turned to her and smiled. "Có lũ số cần một con da." Her face broke into horror. "Cô lũ số cần cha của sa xia. She nên nó của cha thọ tì nữ luôn bê ý lăng sư." "Cô thọ gì à? Nữ lý thao lờ à?" The man in the black mask suddenly stood up and began to pound Gongchi fist after fist, causing the other man to stumble and finally fall to his feet. Jialia screamed, and the man in the black mask stopped. He looked up at her, and she stood, only to fall to the ground sobbing. "Oi, nhớ nói chẳng gọi bỏ chị sao Shirley," the king said as he grabbed her hand and began dragging her down. When they reached the stage, Gongchi finally made his way up to a stand, his face beaten to a bloody pulp, but he managed to swing and hit the other man. "Shaima," he said as he threw Jialia on the ground. She was sobbing and shaking as he laughed. "Gongchi, you ka sa tong Jialia bảo lý có, ô ya ka chịu cả hình gì?" The man in black drew back his fist and slammed it into Gongchi's jaw. He flipped over and coughed out blood as Jialia began crying. And then the man in black turned to look her way, and very slowly with bloody hands reached for his mask and took it off. Both Jialia and Gongchi stood in shock as Shokeng stood before them, breathing hard. Jialia gasped in shock as she stood up, and Gongchi was left speechless. Shokeng bent down and grabbed him by the collar, bringing him to a standing position. Shokeng asked. He slammed his fist into Gongchi's jaw, and he dropped to the ground as Jialia screamed his name and ran into his arms. "Kutumita, dân tên bộ tư, giờ yo đến bộ cha, cụ y lưng, tên là yo poto gọ sư," he whispered. "Wa cháu ở nơi sẽ trường nó cổng, cháu lưu chúa tuần trí, tuần trâu yo tờ sư ra tên nó, bé mà đi xin chi đồ à."